Crossing the dark water. The morning air over the lake was thick enough to chew, a damp, gray wool that clung to Sarah's skin like a second layer of clothing. She gripped the rough, splintered wood of the oars, her knuckles white. Across from her, Rachel was busy untangling a neon-pink windbreaker from the rusted oarlock of their borrowed rowboat, her laughter ringing out across the glassy, dead-still water. "If this thing sinks," Rachel said, flashing a grin that was far too bright for the dreary landscape, "I'm blaming your meticulous navigation skills." "We're supposed to be heading north, Sarah, not into the afterlife." Sarah looked up, her gaze drifting toward the dense, suffocating mist that swallowed the far horizon. "It's not navigation, Rach. It's an adventure. Isn't that what you said? The legends of the forgotten house are just stories told to keep kids from skipping school." "Exactly. And now we get to prove it," Rachel said, leaning back. The boat rocked, a wet, slapping sound against the hull that felt inexplicably loud in the unnatural silence of the lake. "Think of the content, Sarah. If we find so much as a rotting porch swing, we'll be local legends by tomorrow." Sarah forced a chuckle, though it caught in her throat. She pulled the oar back, feeling the resistance of the water. It felt thick, almost viscous, as if the lake itself were trying to hold them back. She looked at Rachel, her best friend since they were 6, and felt a strange, jarring spike of protectiveness. Rachel's hair was tied back in a messy knot, her eyes dancing with that infectious, reckless curiosity that had always been the fuel for their escapades. "The boat seems heavy," Sarah remarked, her voice dropping, losing its playful edge. She looked down at the floorboards, coated in a fine, dark silt. "Maybe we should have checked the weight capacity." "It's an old boat on an old lake, Sarah." "It's supposed to be heavy," Rachel teased, reaching out to trail her fingers in the water. Sarah grabbed Rachel's wrist before her hand could break the surface. "Don't." Rachel blinked, pulling back, her smile faltering for a microsecond. "Whoa. You're wound tight today. Is this about the dream again?" Sarah didn't answer. She couldn't tell Rachel that the dream, that recurring nightmare of teeth and shadow, felt less like a fabrication of her subconscious and more like a warning. Instead, she adjusted her grip on the oars and pushed harder. The mist seemed to thicken, pressing against the sides of the boat, muffling the world until the only sound was the rhythmic, labored dip and pull of the wood. "I just have a weird feeling," Sarah whispered, her eyes fixed on the gray void ahead. "Like we're being watched by something that doesn't blink." "That's just the island, Sarah," Rachel said, though she sat up straighter, smoothing out her windbreaker. "Every local tells the same ghost story to make the place seem more interesting." "Oh, don't go to the island, the trees have eyes. It's meant to scare the tourists, not us." "And yet, here we are," Sarah muttered. "Here we are," Rachel agreed, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The explorers of the unknown. Just you, me, and a boat that might be held together by rust and bad intentions." Sarah pushed again, and for a moment, the mist parted. There it was, a jagged silhouette rising from the water like a broken spine. The island. It looked darker than the surrounding landscape, a bruised purple stain against the muted tones of the morning. The trees were twisted, reaching toward the sky like gnarled fingers, and the house, the forgotten house, sat atop the highest ridge, its windows dark and hollow, staring down at them like the eye sockets of a skull. "See?" Rachel whispered, her bravado finally fracturing just a little. "It's real." Sarah felt a cold shiver trace the line of her spine. The air around the boat had grown deathly still. The birds, which had been silent since they left the dock, seemed to have vanished entirely, leaving a void of sound that made her own breathing sound like a thunderstorm. "We don't have to stay long," Sarah said, though she knew the lie. The island had an aura of gravity, a pull that felt magnetic and inescapable. "Just a look. A few photos, and we're back." "Yeah," Rachel said, her voice small. She reached out, gripping the side of the boat, her nails digging into the wood. "Just a look." Sarah dug the oars deep into the black water. The island loomed, growing larger, more oppressive with every stroke. The scent of ozone and something iron-rich and ancient drifted toward them, a smell that triggered a primal, frantic alarm in the back of Sarah's mind. She didn't turn back. She didn't stop. She pushed the boat forward, deeper into the shadow, right into the jaws of the secret that had been waiting for them for years. The oars cut into the water with a sound like tearing silk. It wasn't the rhythmic splash of a summer outing. The lake had grown thick, viscous, the surface coated in a slick, oily sheen that clung to the wood of the boat. Sarah watched the ripples, but they didn't behave like water. They moved with a strange, sluggish intention, coiling away from the hull as if the lake itself were trying to avoid them. She gripped the oar tighter, her knuckles white, the wood splintering slightly under the pressure. "Sarah? You okay?" Rachel was seated in the bow, her silhouette framed by the encroaching wall of gray fog. She had been humming a nervous, upbeat melody a few minutes ago, something from a pop song they'd heard on the radio on the drive up, but the song had died a slow, strangled death. Now, Rachel's posture was stiff, her hands clutching the edges of the gunwale so hard her fingernails were bloodless. "I'm fine," Sarah lied, her voice sounding unervingly loud in the absolute silence. "Just currents stronger than I thought." "It doesn't feel like a current," Rachel whispered. She turned to look back, and the movement was jerky, unnatural. She shivered, a sharp, full-body tremor that rattled the small wooden vessel. "It feels like the water is waiting for us to stop moving." Sarah didn't want to admit how right she was. She stared into the dark expanse ahead. The fog wasn't just weather, it was a physical barrier, swirling in intricate, hypnotic patterns that seemed to mimic the shape of eyes, of reaching limbs. Every time she blinked, the shapes seemed to shift, getting closer, creeping inward. "Don't look at it," Sarah said, though she couldn't tear her own gaze away. "Just keep looking at me, Rach." Rachel obeyed, but her eyes were glassy, unfocused. She started to tremble again, a rhythmic, violent shaking that rocked the boat. She pulled her knees to her chest, trying to ground herself, but the wood beneath them groaned in sympathy. "I can hear it," Rachel breathed, her voice cracking. "Sarah, do you hear that?" "Hear what?" "A heartbeat. But it's not mine. It's underneath us." Sarah froze. She shifted her weight, and the boat listed dangerously. She dipped her hand toward the water, just an inch above the surface, intending to splash it against her face to wake up, to clear the mounting hysteria. But before her fingers touched the oily liquid, the water surged. It didn't splash, it reached. A small, black tendril of water rose up, spiraling like a serpent's tail, hovering just inches from Sarah's skin. It was cold, a cold that didn't just chill the air, but seemed to reach into her very marrow, stealing the heat from her blood. Sarah jerked her hand back, nearly capsizing the boat. "God. What is it?" Rachel scrambled toward the center of the boat, her eyes wide, darting toward the dark water. "Sarah, what was that?" "Nothing," Sarah said, though her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Just debris. Some kind of algae bloom, maybe." "That wasn't algae," Rachel said, her voice rising to a frantic pitch. "It looked at me. The whole lake, it's watching us." Sarah reached out, grabbing Rachel's shoulders. The girl was ice cold, her skin clammy and pale in the shifting mist. "Listen to me. We're going to row. We're going to keep our heads down, we're going to hit the shore, and we're going to get back in that car and go home. Forget the house. Forget the legend. We are turning around, right now." But as Sarah turned to dip the oars back into the water, she stopped. The direction they had come from was gone. The shoreline they had left behind, the trees, the parking lot, everything had been swallowed by an impenetrable, suffocating wall of gray. They were suspended in a void, the only reality being the boat and the dark, rhythmic pulsing of the lake beneath them. "Sarah," Rachel whispered, and this time there was no spirit in her voice, only a hollow, terrifying realization. "The boat isn't moving anymore. Sarah pulled on the oars with all her strength, but the boat stayed perfectly, unervingly still. It felt as if they were anchored to the center of the earth. The silence was broken then, not by a voice, but by a sound that made Sarah's soul coil in revulsion. It was a low, resonant thrumming. It vibrated up through the oars, through the soles of her sneakers, and into her bones. It was a heartbeat. The lake was breathing. Thump thump. Thump thump. It's not just the water, Rachel said, pointing ahead. The fog began to tear away, shredded by some unseen force. The island appeared. It didn't look like a place of earth and stone. It rose out of the lake like a jagged, black tooth, rotting and diseased. The trees were skeletal, their branches twisted into claw-like protrusions that scraped against the sky. There was no color here, only shades of bruised purple and necrotic gray. The house stood at the center, a Victorian monstrosity of peeling paint and shattered glass, its windows staring out like empty eye sockets. It wasn't just a house. It was a mouth, and they were drifting directly into its gullet. "We have to turn back," Sarah said, her voice a desperate whisper. She dug the oars in, screaming at her muscles to obey, but the boat seemed to be dragged forward by a magnetic, inexorable gravity. "I can't," Rachel cried, clutching her head. She collapsed onto the floorboards, curling into a fetal position. "It's screaming, Sarah. Can't you hear it screaming?" Sarah could hear it. It wasn't a sound, but a psychic weight, a chorus of voices begging for mercy, muffled and distorted by layers of earth and time. The desperation of it was suffocating. She felt a phantom pain spike in her own chest, a searing heat that mirrored the intensity of the house's aura. She looked at her friend, seeing the way Rachel's hair stood on end, the way the shadows seemed to lengthen around her, pinning her to the boat. The innocence they had arrived with was being stripped away, peeled back layer by the sheer, malevolent intent of the island. The boat hit the silt with a sickening crunch. They weren't at a dock. They were at a jagged, mud-slicked embankment that smelled of ancient decay and wet iron. The water behind them had turned pitch black, the surface smooth as a mirror, showing not their reflections, but something else, distorted, elongated versions of themselves, their eyes glowing with a faint, hungry light. Sarah stood, her legs trembling, her balance compromised by the shifting, unnatural energy of the place. She looked toward the house. The front door was slightly ajar, inviting them in with a darkness that felt thicker, heavier than the fog. "Rachel," Sarah said, reaching down to pull her friend up. "Get up. We have to go. Now." Rachel didn't answer. She was staring at the house, her eyes wide, her mouth slightly agape. She stood up slowly, her movements jerky and stiff, like a puppet on fraying strings. "It's beautiful," Rachel whispered, the words devoid of her usual inflection. Sarah felt a surge of cold terror. She gripped Rachel's arm, her nails digging in. "Rachel, look at me. That's not you talking. Look at me." Rachel turned, and for a fleeting second, the old Rachel, the friend who laughed at urban legends, the girl who loved to explore, flickered in her eyes. It was a spark of pure, unadulterated fear. "Sarah," Rachel choked out, "don't let me go." Then, the door to the house creaked wider. A gust of wind rushed out, smelling of stale incense and dried blood, hitting them with the force of a physical blow. The air turned frigid, frosting the air between them. Sarah felt the island's gravity shift, a sudden, violent pull that dragged them toward the rotted wooden steps. They were no longer two friends on an adventure. They were prey, and the house had finally opened its doors to feed. The wood of the rowboat groaned, a long, splintering protest against the unnatural stillness of the water. Sarah shoved the oars deep, but the blades didn't splash. They sliced through the black surface with the sound of a knife cutting through wet silk. Beside her, Rachel stood up, her hand gripping the gunwale. Her knuckles were stark white against the gloom. "Do you hear that?" Rachel whispered, her voice barely audible over the oppressive, heavy silence. Sarah didn't look up from the oars. She didn't want to look at the shoreline that was finally materializing out of the mist. The island wasn't a place of earth and trees anymore. It looked like a jagged, rotted tooth pushing up from the throat of the lake. "I don't hear anything, Rach." "That's the problem," Sarah said, her voice tight. "It's too quiet. Even the wind stopped." "It's just the fog," Rachel replied, though she didn't sit back down. She was staring at the tree line. The trees weren't swaying, but they seemed to lean toward the water, their branches gnarled and claw-like, reaching out as if waiting for the boat to drift within range. "Maybe we should head back. The house, it doesn't look like an adventure anymore. It looks like a graveyard." Sarah felt the shift in her own chest, a cold, tightening coil of dread that had nothing to do with urban legends. She had come here for the thrill of the dare, the rush of proving the locals wrong, but the air here tasted like copper and old, stagnant water. The forgotten house, perched on the high ridge, wasn't just a dilapidated Victorian shell. It felt like an eye, watching them with a malevolent, ancient intelligence. "We're almost there," Sarah said, though her arms ached with a sudden, localized fatigue. "We pull up, we take the photos, we leave. 5 minutes, tops." "Sarah, look at the water," Rachel murmured. Sarah glanced down. Trailing behind their oars, the wake wasn't bubbling white. It was black, oily, and shimmering with an iridescent sheen that looked like spilled gasoline. As she watched, a ripple, thick and rhythmic, pulsed against the side of the boat, as if the lake itself were breathing beneath them. The boat hit the silt with a sickening, wet crunch. They weren't at a dock. They were at a marshy, tangled shelf of gray mud that smelled of decay and rusted metal. The prow of the boat bit deep into the sludge, jerking them both forward. Rachel stumbled, catching herself on the seat, her eyes wide. "We have to go back," Rachel insisted, her bravado completely dissolved. "Now. Put it in reverse." Sarah stood, her boots sinking into the muck at the bottom of the boat. She looked toward the house again. The windows were hollow, staring back at them with a darkness that was deeper than the night surrounding them. She felt a sudden, sharp vibration in her teeth, a low-frequency hum that seemed to rattle her very marrow. "I can't," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a whisper. She looked at the oars. They were stuck, seized by the thick, gelatinous mud that was rapidly rising around the boat, bubbling up like boiling tar. "Something is grabbing the hull." "Sarah!" Rachel screamed, pointing at the shore. Shadows were detaching themselves from the base of the trees. They didn't move like people, they moved like ink dropped into a glass of water, expanding and thinning, shifting into elongated shapes that lacked a clear silhouette. Sarah grabbed the flashlight she brought, clicking it on. The beam cut through the mist, but it didn't illuminate the shore. It stopped dead against a wall of gray, light-absorbing haze only a few feet away. The light flickered, dying out as if something had inhaled the energy from the batteries. "Get out," Sarah commanded, her instincts overriding her terror. "If we stay in the boat, we're targets. We run for the high ground." "Are you crazy? Look at those things." Rachel grabbed Sarah's arm, her grip frantic. Sarah looked at her friend. For a heartbeat, she saw the girl she'd known her whole life, the laughter, the bright curiosity, flickering behind a veil of pure, primal panic. She realized then that there would be no going back. The island wasn't letting them leave. The house on the hill wasn't just waiting for them, it had been hungry for them since the moment they put the boat into the water. "We have no choice," Sarah said, her voice hardening. She kicked the side of the boat, breaking the suction of the muck, and scrambled over the side, her boots sinking into the freezing, foul-smelling mire of the shoreline. Rachel followed, gasping as her feet hit the mud. The moment they both stood on the island, the silence shattered. It wasn't a sound. It was a sensation, a psychic weight that slammed into them like a physical blow. The trees around them began to moan, a sound like grinding bone. The ground beneath their feet pulsed, once, twice, rhythmic and steady. "It's not just a house," Rachel whispered, her eyes fixed on the path that led toward the structure. "It's a heart." Before Sarah could respond, a figure stepped from the mist. He was tall, gaunt, and wore a coat that seemed to absorb the light around him. His hair was a shock of unnatural, vivid red, standing out against the gray landscape like a bleeding wound. He didn't walk, he glided, his feet barely depressing the soft earth. He stopped a dozen paces away. He didn't have a weapon, but the air around him curdled, smelling of ozone and dried blood. "You're late," the man said. His voice was smooth, cultured, and carried a tone of disappointment that chilled Sarah's blood more than the frigid air. "The ritual requires specific timing. You've made the transition far more tedious than it needed to be." Sarah stepped in front of Rachel, raising her hands. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, but she felt a strange, detached clarity rising to meet the fear. "Who are you?" Sarah demanded, her voice steady despite the trembling in her legs. "We're leaving. We're getting back in that boat." The man with the red hair tilted his head. A slow, predatory smile spread across his face, revealing teeth that were too long, too sharp, and far too white. "The boat is no longer a concern, little spark," he said. He flicked a hand, and behind them, the rowboat groaned again, its wooden frame splintering as it was dragged down into the sucking mire of the shore, swallowed whole by the island. "You aren't here to leave. You are here to evolve." Rachel let out a strangled cry, backing away, but her heels hit a tangle of roots that seemed to animate, rising up to wrap around her ankles like vipers. She fell, the mud splashing up against her face. "Rachel!" Sarah lunged forward, but the man was faster. He blurred, moving with a speed that defied physics. One moment he was 10 paces away, the next, he was standing over Rachel, his hand clamped firmly around her throat. He lifted her effortlessly, her feet kicking against the empty air. "She has such spirit," the man purred, looking at Rachel with the detached interest of a collector examining an insect. "Such potential. It would be a waste to break her too quickly." Sarah didn't think. She didn't calculate the odds. She lunged at him, throwing her weight into a desperate tackle, hoping to knock him off balance. She hit him, but it was like hitting a wall of cold stone. He didn't even budge. Instead, he turned his head, his yellow eyes locking onto Sarah's. The power radiating from him was suffocating, a dark, heavy pressure that crushed the air from her lungs. "And you," he whispered, his free hand lashing out to catch Sarah by the wrist. His skin was ice cold, a freezing burn that sent a shockwave of agony up her arm. "You possess the defiance that makes for a truly exquisite transformation." Sarah tried to scream, but the sound died in her throat as his grip tightened, the bones in her wrist groaning under the pressure. The world began to tilt, the mist swirling faster, tighter, until the only things she could see were the man's eyes and the terror in Rachel's face. "Welcome to the island," he said, his voice echoing inside her skull. "The night is just beginning." He threw her aside like a discarded toy. Sarah landed hard, her shoulder slamming into the trunk of a dead tree. As she struggled to push herself up, her vision blurred, the trees spinning into a vortex of gray and black. Through the haze, she saw him lean down toward Rachel, his mouth opening, his fangs descending in a sickening, fluid movement. "No!" Sarah shrieked, clawing at the mud, trying to find her feet, but her body felt leaden, disconnected. The man ignored her. He leaned into the curve of Rachel's neck, and as he sank his teeth home, a scream ripped through the air, a sound of such raw, absolute agony that the very trees seemed to recoil. The world went black, but the screaming didn't stop. It vibrated in Sarah's bones, a harbinger of the nightmare that had finally claimed them. She tried to crawl, to reach out, but the shadows of the island surged forward, rising up to meet her like a closing shroud, dragging her down into the cold, silent dark. The innocence of the girl who had rowed onto the lake was dead. In its place, something new, something hungry and terrifying, began to stir.